Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are now live. My name is Francesca Dattesi, and I work for Climate Action Network International. And on behalf of the organizing committee, which is composed of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, Climate Action Network International, the Women and Gender Constituency, and the Youth Constituency at the UNFCCC, I would like to welcome all of you, the distinguished experts, the panel, and all of those joining us online to our event towards BAM, the public hearings on the Just Transition Mechanism. For the past few years, civil society has been engaging intensively on just transition at global climate conferences as a means to ensure that all aspects of climate action embrace the need for securing rights and justice for workers, indigenous peoples, and communities, and support all countries in their efforts to find pathways for their people's prosperity. COP30 constituted a major landmark for advancing justice, equity, and rights through just transition. A decision was taken there outlining key principles that must be taken into account when advancing just transition. And on top of that, and critical to civil society demands, it committed to develop for decision in 2026 a just transition mechanism that will make all of those principles and aspects to be materialized. Our groups outlined several demands regarding the mechanism, which we have called the BAM, that now stands for the Belém-Antalya Mechanism for Just Transition. And as we prepare for the next round of negotiations, we wanted to hear from experts and practitioners that go well beyond our constituencies. We wanted to hear their thoughts on how we can make the Just Transition mechanism really work. So learning from past experiences and accelerating the good work that is happening on the ground. And instead of holding these conversations privately, we have decided to hold them publicly and for the benefit of a much larger audience. And that's why we are today live streaming with all of you. And today, in the second hearing of the day, we are honored to be joined by Amanda Cahill. Amanda is the founder of the NextEconomy, a non-government organization that supports communities across Australia to manage the economic impacts of decarbonization in ways that strengthen regional economies. Most of this work has been in coal and industrial regions, where she has brought together government, industry, workers, and community groups to co-design transition plans, despite deep-seated tensions. Amanda has also advised Australian states and federal government agencies and has played a key role in the development of the NZEA Authority. More recently, she has drawn on her previous experience in international development to provide advice to government and civil society organizations across Asia and the Pacific. Amanda is a Churchill Fellow and co-author of the book Regional Energy Transition in Australia, From Impossible to Possible. So welcome, Amanda. How the session will go is that we'll first have a presentation by Amanda, and then we'll have an interactive exchange with representatives from civil society. And in this session, we have Elena Muller from the Youth Constituency at the UNFCCC and Felicity Sokoko from the Women and Gender Constituency. But first, we're going to hear from you, Amanda. So yeah, happy to hear about your work experience and then have a conversation about the connection from your work to this global mechanism that we're trying to build. But now the floor is yours.
Thanks, Farah, and thanks for organizing all of this. I think it's a brilliant idea, and I think the lessons learned are going to be shared for quite a long time, really useful. So thank you for doing this. Hi, everyone. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples here in Australia and pay my respects to their elders past and present. The land that I live on, there's never been a treaty, so our land has never been ceded, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I'd like to also extend this respect to any other Indigenous peoples or First Nations peoples on this call. And there's a lot of work that's being done in defending and protecting communities and land. And this is a big issue in the transition. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. As was just said, I've been working on the energy transition in Australia for about 15 years and set up an organisation called the NextEconomy in 2018. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we have been learning from that work on the ground. So I'm just going to share some slides. Give me 1 second. There we go. Here we go. Can you see that okay? Yeah, great. So the work that we do is mostly at the regional level. So it's working with communities, often local governments get us in, who are dealing with the energy transition most of the time, and things are changing very quickly, and they want to get on the front foot around planning for that. So our job is to bring all the different stakeholders together, not just community and government, but industry, First Nations groups, training providers, civil society, and others, to have an inclusive participatory process to come up with not just a plan, but how they're actually going to implement that plan. So we also spend quite a bit of time connecting communities with the resources and expertise that they need. But we also translate what we're learning on the ground so that it can inform policy at a government level, but also an industry level, and increasingly in investment decisions as well, to really build in those principles around justice and make sure communities are part of that process. The other role that I play is with the Net Zero Economy Authority. So I was quite involved. This is Australia's transition authority that's really only been up and running since 2024. So I was quite involved with the unions and civil society movement to advocate for setting up an authority. And then I worked quite closely with the government, the Prime Minister's office, Prime Minister and Cabinet, to design the authority, drawing on lessons that I'd learned from looking at the models in the EU, actually, and the UK. So it's great to see some of the people I interviewed on some of the other calls. The main responsibility of the Net Zero Economy Authority is to basically coordinate at a national level, and mostly the focus has been on the closure of coal-fired electricity plants. But they've been expanding their remit to look at how do they get the investment needed into regional areas to diversify regional economies. It's not enough to just look after workers, they've got to have jobs to go to. So how do they start new jobs and green opportunities for those workers? But also, how do they take a regional planning approach to actually look at all the things that a community needs to manage that change, which might include things like infrastructure or water needs, or housing, or training, or health facilities. So increasingly they're looking at that more holistically. And they're also looking at how we implement the First Nations clean energy strategy in Australia so that First Nations communities benefit from the transition as well. The other job is that they're answerable to a whole lot of different stakeholders. So they have this panel, which is made up of union representatives, civil society, different experts in the investment community, and also industry peak bodies as well. So they're an independent authority, but they have to report back to all of these different stakeholder groups. To be clear, I'm not talking for them. I can't talk for the NZEA. I will be talking more from the perspective of the NextEconomy in this presentation. And I'll be talking about Australia in the context of, we're a very privileged country, so we actually have a lot of resources to manage the different aspects of transition well. But we're also in a challenging context in that still about 60% of our energy comes from coal-fired electricity plants, and we are very dependent on massive export industry of coal and gas, so fossil fuel exports. We're the second largest exporter of fossil fuels in the world after Russia. So talking about transition has been politically very difficult. Just having a conversation about it is difficult, let alone actively planning, although we have come a long way since 2022 when the government changed. So there's three kind of insights. I don't want to talk for too long. There's three main top-level insights I want to share from the Australian experience. And the first one, I guess, is that when we talk about transition or just transition in Australia, we're talking about more than just managing the energy system. most of the work has been focused on energy in terms of phasing out fossil fuels and building renewable energy and making sure that everyone has access to reliable and affordable electricity. But it's also other sectors now are also facing decarbonisation, like agriculture, construction, manufacturing, transport. And whichever industry or sector you're looking at, the managing transition, even as a technical or a regional planning approach, involves lots of different things. So yes, you've got to get the energy piece right, but we've also got to diversify the economy, start new businesses while others are being phased out. We need to support workers who are negatively impacted, but create whole new workforces in a country that has workforce shortages. We've got to think about regional planning issues, and we've got to think about how this impacts all sectors of the community. So both minimising the negative impacts, but also how we can capture some of the benefits. If we can do this well, we can address a whole lot of wellbeing issues and leave communities better off if we think about it in that context and putting justice at the centre. And finally, which doesn't often get talked about in a just transition framework, but I think is really important, that this is just as much about the rights of nature as it is of people. So how do we build in environmental considerations into how we do this? We could address climate change, but end up with a whole lot of other environmental issues if we don't think that through. So the first main insight out of the Australian experience is this is really complicated. There's lots of moving parts all happening at the same time. All of these different issues that are listed here fit in different government departments, or different industries are dealing with it, and the investment comes from different areas. So the role of the NZEA or any kind of transition authority, the first thing that they need to do is be able to coordinate across very different areas of expertise. There's resources, there's experts, there's funds, but it's who sits in the middle and whose job is it to actually make sure resources get to where they need to go in real time, because governments aren't able to do this even in countries like Australia. And to give you an example of how I learned this myself firsthand was in this place in the picture called Gladstone, which used to call itself the carbon capital of Australia. It's a high export, it's got a port that exports a high amount of coal and gas. It has heavy industry in terms of manufacturing that use a lot of carbon, like cement and chemicals and explosives. But they actually came to us before the NZEA was set up, and before governments were actively planning transition, and said, can you help us? Because our community is starting to get very divided and we can't even have a conversation about this. But as an industry town, they knew that when things change and multinational companies leave, things are pretty bad for them. So we worked with them on coming up with a 10-year roadmap, and it attracted a huge amount of media interest at the time, but also investor interest. There are a lot of international investors who said, okay, great, let's help you set up the next green industries. So the local leaders united between government, industry, even First Nations leaders and unions, went to different levels of government for support and couldn't navigate this really complex system. So basically, there were some things that got started. There were a lot of missed opportunities, and some of the new industries that got started had now either stalled or stopped. And after 3 years, not only is the community now tired of pushing, but they're very disillusioned about the pace of change. It's not only fueling opposition to the idea of transition, but it's actually fueling membership of far-right parties that are creating more polarisation, saying that the transition has already failed. So that's the first insight. If we can't coordinate to get resources where it's needed, we're going to end up with even more problems down the track. The second kind of point is around how we think about justice. And often in Australia, when we think about a just transition, most people think very much about workers, and workers are the first impacted, it's particularly when it comes to decline or the closure of industries. But there's a whole lot of other people who are already being negatively impacted by the changes in Australia. We're seeing impacts on low-income households because of energy costs at a time of a lot of pressure, which I think a lot of countries are seeing around the world in terms of cost of living pressures. But we're also seeing pressures on First Nations communities where they're expected to open up land for renewable energy developments or critical minerals mining at the same time as they're looking at a decline in the sort of financial payments and royalties that they've historically gotten from oil and gas developments. So there's different groups, and I could go on this name other groups as well. All parts of society are being affected by this transformation of the economy. But it's not just in terms of the negative impacts. We can also build in considerations around equity in sharing of benefits as well. And a really good example of this is, which is not from our work, this is from an amazing organisation called Original Power, an Indigenous-led organisation, and the First Nations Clean Energy Network, working in this community, Borroloola, in the Northern Territory, a remote community that for a long time has suffered from energy poverty. They have been reliant on prepaid meters. They buy a card, like you can see in the picture, and if that runs out, their electricity is cut off for days or even weeks, which has a whole lot of health impacts in terms of food security, medicines being kept cool. There's heat waves. They're living in an area that's getting 50-degree days. So they've had a lot of challenges that the government-run company up there hasn't been dealing with. So Original Power has been working with the community to set up a community-owned solar farm, which has a whole lot of benefits in terms of keeping money and jobs and training opportunities in the community. But they've learnt a lot that has actually been directly influencing the policies and support governments designing to help other communities be able to deal with their energy issues. They're also learning a lot about how to uphold rights in terms of land rights for new developments and also the impacts on cultural heritage. So it's one good example of how we can think about equity and justice in terms of benefits as well. There are other examples, community funds being set up where renewable energies are going in for long-term investment, low-income households like housing improvements around energy efficiency, insulation, etc. And training and employment opportunities for people who've been excluded from job opportunities for a really long time. Young people, First Nations people, people from different backgrounds, women, just some examples. And the final point I want to make is that a just transition is not just about the outcomes, it's about the process. And ideally, just transition is a participatory process, which means building in opportunities for people to participate in the decision-making from the start. Where you're a worker, community member, traditional owner, social service provider, young people, a carer, everyone needs a seat at the table. If we don't have that, we're just going to see even more increases in this mistrust that people have in government industry for very good reason. In Australia, we've seen massive developments that have promised all kinds of benefits that haven't delivered, but have left communities worse off over the long term. But where we are seeing communities participating in planning processes at a local and a national level, we're seeing companies forced to negotiate the kinds of benefits to make sure they're meaningful and long-lasting and positive for the community. We're seeing shared ownership models where communities owning shares in companies and holding them to account. And we're also seeing civil society, unions and others being able to have a seat at that table and hold governments and industry to account around their impacts, their legal responsibilities, and making sure they're upholding the rights of both people and nature. And I could keep going, but I'm going to stop there so we've got more time for discussion.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for sharing some of those opportunities, but also the challenges that came from the experience in Australia. I think, I mean, one of the things that you mentioned at the beginning and that actually came up quite a lot in other sessions of these hearings is this element that, yes, I mean, indeed, even when we're talking about a transition in the energy sector, it always goes much beyond energy. It touches upon supporting workers, diversifying the economy, planning, regional planning issues, equity considerations. So how at the end it's really like a whole of society, whole of the economy kind of approach. But also, noting some of the elements that you mentioned about how important coordination is to ensure that some opportunities are not missed or do not become actually a problem, let's say, but rather that they're taken and co-designed. So yeah, really thank you for sharing all those insights. I'm now gonna, let's say, open the floor for the rest of the panel so that we can have a bit of an interactive discussion. And maybe I'll start with breaking the ice, but then I'll also ask the other panelists to come in. From your experience in Australia, what are some of those lessons learned that you think could be helpful or could be taken into account when we're now thinking about what the mechanism could be doing to accelerate just transition work? So yeah, imagining what are some of those lessons that we could draw upon when thinking about the mechanism. But I'll also see whether Elena or Felicitas have any questions for now.
Yes,
Yes, Elena.
thank you. I'd be happy to ask a question. And I was very, positively, let's say, surprised how well it's working with the stakeholder panel and the participatory processes in the case that you presented. Like, that's super great news, and I think much needed in the UNFCCC as well, and for the just transition mechanism. And I think, or what my question is more like, what do we need as enabling conditions that such participatory processes can even take place? And what needs to go kind of first to actually, host these processes on that high level and on the global scale as well? And how can that be ensured in the BAM?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it is a tricky one, and I think it's one of the sticking points for the negotiators is trying to figure that out. I think there's this kind of overwhelming feeling that if they open the doors to all these people, it's just going to create so much politics that no decisions will ever get made. But I think there's a few different ways of doing it. So the way that the NZEA does it at a national level is it has the stakeholder panel, so we don't have, a way to directly make a decision, but they are responsible, like the NZEA has to report to us. And they do have a board that sits above them, and the board is made up of representatives of the union movement, industry, so some constituency groups that would match against the UN, and then some experts as well. So between the board having that decision-making power and then the panel that they have to report to as they're designing things, I think it's working okay at the moment. It would be different if there's a lot more division within the groups, I think. So, but there's ways of having a consultation group. I think the question around accountability is really important, and having a group that is regularly met with, that they're testing ideas out with, that has constituency representatives of all the groups that you see in the UN is completely doable. The advantage to having a global institution that sits above countries, I saw firsthand when I was in the EU, particularly when the EU set the directive around phasing out the funding for coal, that then made the national governments kind of incentivized that shift for the energy companies and the countries. But there were some countries that weren't living up to their plans or their commitments. And the pressure from the EU created this level of accountability that I saw local level governments skip the national government and then go straight to the EU's just transition mechanism for help. So for the coal regions in transition, for example, that program meant that the coal region that was transitioning didn't have to rely on the national government anymore. So I think that's another layer of accountability that constituency groups and local governments, subnational governments, if there was a global institution, can go to for help if they're stuck. I think that's a few ways of thinking about it. But then there's just knowledge sharing too, and actually connecting constituency groups and local communities across the world so they can share lessons learned and act regardless. And the mechanism really should play a role in facilitating that knowledge sharing. And just back to the first question, I think for me, the core things that the mechanism need to be doing, which I know was in the BAM proposal as well, the coordination thing is key. I think these hearings are showing there's people all over the world who are trying to figure this out. There's lots of experts, there's universities, there's different kinds of think tanks. There's a lot of expertise out in the world. There's also different pots of money that can address different parts of the transition challenge. But it's the coordination piece, so that when countries are struggling and need to figure out things, there's somewhere to go for them to go, we need some help with this, or we need to actually tap into this funding, but we're not sure exactly where to go for that, I think is probably the key thing. The capacity building, knowledge sharing is key, which you talked about, the knowledge sharing platforms, but also training courses and knowledge peer-to-peer sharing and trips to different, I know that in the EU, the example of getting people from one country to go and visit what was happening in other regions was really, that peer-to-peer learning was really key. And then the piece about accountability. So that global kind of, at least knowing what's going on, having an avenue for people to access, and facilitating that participation of diverse stakeholders, I think is the kind of key things that the mechanism can do.
Thanks, Amanda. I think we have time for a couple more questions, so for sure another round. So let's see if the panel has any. If not, I have a follow-up as well. I could start while, yeah, other questions are prepared. So, I mean, the question is, how do you see institutions or authorities like the Net Zero Economy Authority connecting in this, let's say, global mechanism? What do you see some of the connections could be, and like the role in the peer-to-peer, or how do you see them connecting in this more global mechanism as well?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I haven't had a chance to look at some of the other presentations that were done. Like I talked to the Scottish Just Transition Commission years ago, and it'd be interesting to see what they think their role is. I know that there's interest in the NZEA to be able to start supporting particularly our neighbours, so in the Pacific region and Southeast Asia, so our major trading partners, if there's a way to start sharing lessons learned through our foreign affairs and trade mechanism. But at the moment, to be honest, they've got their hands full just trying to figure out Australia. I think there's probably going to be a few years before they're in a position to really start sharing that. An easy win is something that we did years ago, which is just setting up international roundtables, and we invited practitioners, policymakers, and academics in the US, countries across the EU and Australia in real time online, just to do this, basically share lessons learned with each other, and then that enabled them to keep that relationship going. So I think there's already some discussion between the NZEA and counterparts in like Spain, Scotland, Canada, US. I guess the challenge though is that the context for a lot of countries is very different to Australia. Like, working that in many countries that are like in previous life, did a lot of work across Asia and the Pacific and South America. They're very different cultural contexts. They're very different material contexts in terms of even basic infrastructure to work with and priorities. So that's going to be the challenge, is at a global level, how do they, we don't just set up some of the failures that we've had in the past with aid and development, where people from global north countries, fly in and start telling other people what to do when they don't actually understand the context. So I think that's kind of one of the questions I've got, is how do we support that learning, but do it in a way that's respectful and on the terms of the people who are asking for the help. Like we don't go to a community in Australia unless they've invited us in. And I think there's some basic principles there that need to be built in to make sure this is just not another kind of domineering power over colonial kind of exercise.
Thanks. Elena.
Yes, I have a follow-up question on that one exactly, because as soon as some stakeholders are invited in, some are still probably excluded. And
Yep.
I was wondering, how do we make sure the right people are also at the table, and also those who are under-resourced, no time to engage extra from everyday life? How do how can a global mechanism reach the people that are actually in need of support?
That is a really good question. It's something we've struggled with even at a local level. So I think that's the challenge, what a global mechanism can do versus what should be good practice at a local and a national level, I think is an interesting question, because, like, for example, when we first started working in Gladstone, the example I gave, it was almost impossible to get people in the care sector, like the social service sector, to participate. And I knew that they wanted to, but they just didn't have the time. They had too much pressure on. They couldn't afford to take the time to come. And also a lot of First Nations people initially, like, they're being asked to every single consultation and meeting, and they were just like, this is another one, we can't do it. So we had to find ways to meet them where they were at, which was often cups of tea, meeting one-on-one, meeting outside hours, going to the meetings where the social service people were already meeting and talking at that. So we can do that at a local level because it's relationship based. I think the challenge is, how do you scale those relationships at a local level to tap into the architecture that's there through the constituency groups to come up? There's still power dynamics and hierarchy in all of those groups as well, which is the challenge. But again, if there's more and more opportunities to connect and access information in lots of different ways, at least when people can and they're ready, that it's there to tap into is kind of the key thing. If it's not there, then they're not going to be able to do the work. They're not going to have the resources to find who they need. So this is a step in that direction, but how the constituency groups make sure that they are genuinely representing members is going to be a challenge. I know it is in the union movement, because different unions have different priorities, even, in Australia. And I see that on the stakeholder panel. What one union group is saying is different to another union that doesn't actually want the transition to go ahead. So yeah, we have to do the work, but the more we can make it accessible in different ways, the better a chance we've got.
Thank you so much. We still have a bit more time, but so we can see whether there are any further questions. I mean, if not, again, I'm happy to.
I've got a question. For you, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because you've been listening.
I also have one. Yes.
I mean, you've been listening to other people, and I'm interested in what others have said over the week. What's the kind of some of the themes that are coming out about how we enable that participation to happen, especially when we're dealing with different cultures, different contexts that people are working in, and how we make sure that approaches are appropriate.
Thanks, Amanda, for that. I mean, I think we've heard so many different perspectives, and like all the hearings have been from different organizations, institutions, more national, more international, working on specific sectors. So I think there is still, a lot to digest. But I think what came up quite strongly in many of them is this idea of like how to enable this coordination in a multilateral space that then allows us to also, go beyond what is now, I mean, more, let's say, sometimes donor-driven agenda. So how having coordination and discussions at the international level in a global mechanism actually, would allow us to instead design and think together and co-design how some countries might need support or what they could bring to the table and so on in a more, what is the opposite of disingenuous, but in a more transparent way, let's say. Yes.
Yeah. Having said all that, it's interesting. The last couple of years, I've been getting invitations from places like Indonesia and Taiwan saying, can you come and talk to us about the work you're doing? And it's been interesting because at first I was like, how can I share anything that's relevant in your context, because it's so different. But there are themes around and some basic buckets of work that need to be done regardless. Like, we've got to get the technology right around energy. We've got to find a way to move away from fossil fuels, and we need to build renewable energy. And there's lots of different ways we can build renewable energy that have very different outcomes in terms of justice. So sharing those stories and then brainstorming together, I think has been really fascinating, but also, yeah, also quite humbling. Some of the challenges that I've been hearing in other countries are you're dealing with human rights abuses and a whole lot of other issues that are really challenging. But at least some of the core things, I think we can get a lot of benefit out of sharing with each other. And that's providing the resources so people can figure that out in their own context, in their own time.
Yeah, and I mean, a bit not super related, but connected to this, one of the discussions that we had in some of the other panels was also about financing just transition. So maybe, yeah, from your experience and yeah, what has been done in Australia, how do you see the intersection between just transition and financing, or what I mean, what financing and for what aspects of just transition, let's say, because that's also part of the things that we're trying to unpack in the conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I think that is going to be the biggest challenge. I think it's interesting that the call hasn't been to set up a new fund. It's actually to try and figure out how to get the resources that are there to where they're needed in a timely way. And I think also the challenge is at the right scale. So to give you a couple of examples, I'll pick on Australian experience, but I know it's common in a lot of other countries as well. The Australian government, since 2022, has set up some very large funds to try and invest to accelerate the transition. Now, whether that's renewable energy or green manufacturing through the Future Made in Australia plan that they've got. But the challenge is government wants to get like huge, and same with the multilateral development banks and a lot of aid agencies. The scale of the funding that they put on offer is completely inappropriate to the types of projects that are actually needed. And it's designed for like big companies to take advantage of, when actually what the regions need is sometimes things that the government hasn't thought of. It's like upgrading the water treatment plant to be able to deal with chemicals and wastewater. It's smaller and it doesn't fit into the government's imagination of what is needed. So I think that's the challenge, is how do you have the right flexible funding that can respond to what's needed rather than having to fit a certain bucket. That's the first thing. The second thing is this big debate around public versus private finance. And what is appropriate in terms of government money, or should we just leave it to the market? And to give you an example, in the state I'm living in, we had both federal and state government for a while open up a whole lot of public funding to say, okay, we're going to start the seed funding to invest in new industries, green hydrogen, for example. And the state owned some of the big infrastructure, so they could incentivize private investment in those industries. But then the government changed at a state level and they pulled all of that funding and support out into the ecosystem. So it wasn't actually the enterprise. It was like the private companies had to pay to set up, but it was the port infrastructure, the water infrastructure, the roads, the things that the company needs, that the company's not going to build. And as soon as the government pulled that money out, that investment fell over. And not only that project, but 60 other green hydrogen projects around the world, because that was the biggest and most advanced green hydrogen project. And it just sent shockwaves, like everyone lost confidence. So I think we're in a game where it's like transition is possible, but as soon as there's anything slightly negative or risky and people start pulling the money out, it's like a domino effect. And that just undermines people's confidence, and it leaves communities with the impacts of that. And it's criminal, actually. I think it's like, how do you keep that? So the role of public finance, long-term, doesn't expect a big return, is responsible for the things that are the foundation for well-being and economic activity. But we also need to hold private finance to account around what they should pay for, but also what they need to reinvest back into the community, that they don't get a free ride, make lots of money, and then take their profit somewhere else. And I think that's the challenging thing in the current system that we're here in now.
Thanks. Yeah, in fact, that was gonna be my follow-up question, like this element of what is then good use of public money and what instead should be left to, yeah, to the private sector.
Oh, just another thing to add to that, actually. The other thing that they've done, which I think is clever, it took a bit of convincing, is that if they're releasing any public funding, then there needs to be some criteria that actually spells out the kind of justice principles around the type of development they want to see. And I know that Spain's also done this with their just transition planning process. So building in things like quotas around women's employment or Indigenous employment or environmental considerations or circular economy in the way that they operate. In Australia, what they've done, they haven't set it as regulation, as expectations. It's more if you're competing to get government support, the company that does more to ensure justice principles and has shown that it's engaged with communities effectively and has been guided by what communities want, and addresses things, like I said before, it's almost like a race to the top. So you're actually, the public money is then going to the person who's promising to do more better development. So I think it's still new, but it seems to be working quite well at the moment.
Thanks. And maybe, yeah, I mean, I think we're ready to start wrapping up. But maybe one final question is, when we're thinking about, yeah, the representation of countries in the mechanism and the complementarity of negotiators and practitioners, how, yeah, do you think we could get the right blend, let's say, in the mechanism when we're thinking really a big question, initial thoughts. There are no answers in this hearing, but then, yeah, then we're gonna wrap up.
It feels like I was thinking about how would you go about designing this, given that different countries are in completely different starting points on where are they on this transition, but also what is transition? What's the worker transition in different countries? Like in Australia, it's, coal and the export market. That's a different challenge, particularly the export industry and how we shut that down and manage that transition, to other countries where I know that their emissions reductions priorities are things like more around the burning of wood and for cooking, or the impact around agriculture and the opportunities to actually draw down emissions as well. So I think in terms of the makeup, it's almost like we need to have the mechanism, but there's almost different divisions that need to be set up that sort of track against, I guess, similar types of countries, challenges and opportunities. So, SIDS, so small island developing states and places like the Pacific, the justice issues and the work that needs to be done there is very different from, I've been talking to people across a number of different African countries. It's a very different challenge there, but in those regions there are some similarities. So it's almost like there needs to be different divisions set up to facilitate the networks and the sharing and the right type of content within those spheres, rather than we just have this group of experts at the top that are expected to know everything about everywhere, because it's not going to work like that. So that geographic representation and expertise needs to be there. And I think there'll be some surprising kind of connection points. Like I was talking to someone in Mongolia 2 weeks ago, and some of their challenges are not the same as other Asian states. They're actually probably more like some of the African challenges. So I think there's a way to do this. The main thing that's exciting to me is that they agreed to set this up and now we've got to make the most of it. And I think we're in a time where we've got the technology to connect people and share it. And I think we've got to do it in a way that is flexible and opens things up and doesn't get bogged down in bureaucracy and some people trying to control it. That's going to be the challenge this year, because there were people that as soon as the Net Zero Economy Authority was announced, wanted to change what it was doing for their own ends, and we had to sort of fight to keep it on track. So, but it's a good problem to have. I look forward to seeing what the network can do in the design process.
Thanks for that reflections, Amanda. So I think, yeah, we are ready to start wrapping up. But I really wanted to thank Amanda for sharing all of these lessons and ideas that, yeah, can help us think, I mean, lessons from the Sri Lankan context, but also ideas that can help us think about the mechanism. I mean, starting from how having a global mechanism could serve indeed to support, but also for accountability issues, how important it is, yeah, to indeed connect and coordinate among all these different groups. And I like what you said, how, I mean, it's clear that there are all these people, institutions, and authorities all over the world trying to think and how to make the transition happen, and how the mechanism can indeed, I mean, is a big opportunity to bring together all these different types of expertise and see where support can be given, where contribution can be given, and what can be done together to advance international cooperation on just transition. And also this element of really ensuring that when we talk about support or learning is done in a way that is respectful towards the different types of expertise and context. And yeah, the final ideas of how we could start thinking about modalities or how to design it. So thank you very much, Amanda, for joining us, and also to Elena and Felicitas, who have been with me in the panel. We're now basically gonna close this session, and the next one is gonna be a bit different because we're gonna get a bit of a break. So we're gonna start in 1 hour and 10 minutes. So at 12 GMT, and in the next panel, we'll hear experiences from the civil society and indigenous peoples mechanism for relations with the UN Committee on World Food Security. And basically, for those of you that are like following us online, for the next session, we're gonna be able to stream both in Spanish and in English. So basically, when you come back and you refresh the YouTube channel of CAN International at 12 GMT, you're gonna be able to select whether to hear the session in Spanish or in English. So yeah, thank you very much again, and I'll close the
Thank
stream
you.
now.